Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Chapter 4 podcast. Hope you're having a lovely day. Excuse me. This chapter we're going to focus on performance anxiety and some key concepts related to the difference between arousal, anxiety, stress, all these different terms that we might use and how they apply to sport. This particular chapter matches up well with Chapter 12, which is one of your later units that talks a lot about anxiety regulation. So these two kind of go together because this is the theory and the underlying concepts of the idea, and then Chapter 12 is really the technique for regulation of arousal, anxiety, and stress processes, part of the application of sports psych. So let's get right into it. The two key terms that you want to be familiar with in this unit are arousal and anxiety. Arousal really refers to physiological activation, although in this terminology it's saying a blend of psychological and physiological. This is actually a typo from the publisher, so let me go ahead and fix that for you. So I'll apologize for that. They've made a mistake there. So arousal in itself is, you can think of as a continuum basically from sleep to absolute elation or panic, or your body is basically humming on a scale of 10. It's a physiological and psychological process, but compared to anxiety is purely psychological. So arousal you should think of as more physiological and just varies in intensity. It's a natural process, and it can be changed by a variety of things, including drugs and caffeine and physiological activities like warming up, running, sprinting, breathing. And anxiety is primarily driven by cognitive factors such as self-talk and our interpretation of things. So arousal, physiology primarily, with some psychological interpretation, and anxiety is really a negative state associated with worry and apprehension. So anxiety, really the underlying concept is the idea of whether you're interpreting something as a challenge to you or a threat to you. So if you're interpreting a stressor or some situation, be it an interview, a test, a performance, and you see that as a challenge, you might imagine what your response typically is to a challenge. You move toward the challenge, you're ready to take on the challenge, you feel you're capable of going after that challenge. If, however, you view something as a threat, for whatever reason, a threat to your self-esteem, a threat to your profession, future scholarships, anything like that, then you're going to start to initiate the stress process, and your perception is, oh no, I'm not ready for this, I can't deal with this, I'm worried about this, and that's where you get into a negative state that we're going to get more specific in terms of what can happen with that. So definitely should be familiar with the two general terms here, and it's further broken down in your book in these capacities here. So from the personality chapter, hopefully now you're familiar with traits and states. So in general, just to review, traits are enduring characteristics that we tend to have typical responses across situations, and then states refer to specifically how we're feeling in a particular moment. So just comparing trait anxiety to state anxiety right here, you can see that trait anxiety is a learned disposition, and they're calling it acquired here, to perceive a wide range of non-dangerous circumstances as threatening. So obviously if we're all being attacked by some sort of wild animal like a grizzly bear or something, that's what anxiety's for. It's meant to mobilize our systems, get us to produce adrenaline so that we can escape being killed. So it's a fairly primal mechanism, but there's a particular terminology you want to be aware of here: non-dangerous circumstances. So losing a tennis match does not threaten your well-being. It's only the perception of how important that is that we place on it that makes it an anxiety-producing situation. So a person with high trait anxiety is going to be more likely to assess a variety of these situations that are not life-threatening, that are not dangerous to us, as an anxiety-producing situation, and they're going to generate their own stress. So they are, in some way, their own worst enemy when it comes to generating this stress. And really, ultimately, we all are, unless you're living in impoverished circumstances. But if you're taking an online course at West Virginia University, you're probably doing okay for yourself. So you're probably not facing too many situations in your daily life that threaten your well-being. And so most anxiety that you experience is self-generated. So one of the big skills in sports psychology for athletes to learn is to control what they can control, to evaluate it in a realistic way, and then to spend as little energy or effort on the things that they cannot control, and not to blow it out of proportion. State anxiety translates directly from your trait anxiety. That's just the moment-to-moment, your changes in how you're feeling about some situation. So it's a direct relationship. If you have high trait anxiety, you are more inclined to experience more state anxiety. But there is some situations where you might be a very calm person, but whatever the moment is, whatever the situation is, you might have a really specific fear of public speaking or taking standardized tests. So normally your typical response is, I'm calm, I'm cool-headed, but in those specific moments you have high state anxiety. Whereas those with high trait anxiety experience many of those situations as very anxiety-provoking. Arousal we already talked about. Now, in state anxiety, the experience can be broken down into cognitive and somatic elements. So basically thoughts and body feelings. So this is the pure physiological piece of anxiety and the symptoms that you might be experiencing, and these are your negative thoughts and worries. So this is pure self-talk, pure brain cognitive stuff here. And so anxiety can typically be experienced across symptoms across each of these. So let's have a look at just some of the most common symptoms. You might think to yourself, in a moment where you've, particularly in sport, can you think of a time where you were really anxious or stressed out about a particular competition? Just think for a moment about that scenario. What was that like? Who were you competing against? What was the situation? And what did it feel like? What were the symptoms for you of the anxiety response? What kind of physiological symptoms did you have? What kind of cognitive or what kind of thoughts were going through your head? And the research shows that the responses are quite varied. Negative self-talk would definitely be one of the cognitive symptoms. One of the somatic symptoms that's very common is constant need to urinate. So your system's cranking, you're feeling stressed, and so basically you just have to go pee more. So anytime caffeine has the same effect, gives you a constant need or a more increased need. You're going to sweat more because again your systems are firing. You through the process of stress and anxiety, you are turning on a system that doesn't really need to be on, but your body doesn't know that because you're controlling it with your mind. So it's wasting energy, it's burning energy trying to fight something that's not there. And so obviously if you leave that on too long, that system, it's basically your sympathetic nervous system. If you leave it on too long, it's just going to wear you out. It's going to take energy out of you, which is critical for athletes, particularly those in endurance sports. So there's nothing wrong with being anxious, particularly the day of an event. Almost every athlete's going to have some butterflies or some cold hands or maybe need to pee more. But if they have it for 5 days ahead of an event, it's a real big problem. They might be very distracted and they're internally focused because they're worried about something. They might actually get sick. I've certainly had a few clients that would throw up before races, like track athletes or wrestlers, and would be so nervous that they wouldn't know any other strategy to help them get rid of the anxiety except to go throw up before an event. And as you can imagine, from a hydration and a nutritional standpoint, that's not a real effective strategy. Feeling thirsty, getting a headache, some others. You're going to be tense, not going to be able to concentrate well. It just kind of does disrupt you. Maybe you can't eat if you've ever been really nervous before an interview or something of that nature. And anytime you have this situation where you're feeling these symptoms and you're evaluated, it basically magnifies that. So an interview, a performance where scouts are coming to watch you and you're feeling very anxious and threatened by the situation, it's definitely not going to be your best performance. And so this is the number one issue that athletes have to learn to deal with. In all my work with athletes, everybody experiences it, and some people have a much better set of skills to cope with it. As I mentioned before, the idea of fatigue. So if you have a lot of tension in your muscles from anxiety, because it basically puts them on guard, and you have that for several days before a big event, without really even knowing why, your legs are going to start to feel heavy. You're not going to have the same pep that you would hope you would have before a race, particularly if it's a something that's totally fitness determined. You know, a 1,500 meter race, a 5K race, a long swim, even a sprint, really, because you're going to feel heavier. And you really won't understand why, because you've already done the damage on Wednesday for the race that's happening on Saturday. Because if you spend too much time with excessive anxiety, then it's really going to disrupt your natural process. And it does that through a variety of things. I've mentioned fatigue, talked about the tension, and it basically makes your motor movements, you know, throwing, running, serving a tennis ball, hitting a volleyball, pitching, it makes all of those things less smooth, okay, and more difficult to do. So it increases the likelihood that you'd be injured. You know, if you've ever had to pitch or serve a tennis ball when you're anxious, it becomes very difficult to execute those movements. Golfing's the same way. You have more tension in your swing, you're much more likely to block it out to the right, hit a big slice, shank it, because you're not having a natural motor performance. You disrupt yourself through that anxiety. There's also a very specific change that the research has shown in terms of what happens to your attentional field when you get an increase in arousal. So as your arousal goes up, you see a drastic change. You'll see a very narrowing of attention. You'll see a shift to whatever your dominant attentional style is, and we'll look at that in some later chapters. And typically athletes will focus on something that's totally not related to the task. So it could be one specific athlete or fan or something else that's really distracted them, or it could be an internal thought about how awful it's going to be if they lose this this event, this match, this game, or whatever. So it becomes very much focused on performance, outcomes, and irrelevant thoughts. So it looks a little bit like this. So when you're, this is an example of a football player, imagine like a quarterback. If you have a moderate level of arousal, kind of what you would hope to have, you know, not too high, not too low, the middle path, you'll kind of pick up what you need to pick up. So you're somewhat focused on seeing out into the secondary as a quarterback, but you're also able to pick up information coming from, from the side. If you get too high of arousal, you can see you get locked in maybe on one receiver, one person, and you ignore other information that might be critical outside of that field. Whereas if you're overconfident or you're totally under-aroused, you're not really tuned in, you're not in the zone, you're not able to focus appropriately. So you have too broad of an attentional field. Okay, so high arousal, highly stressed, you get locked in, get panicked, too narrow of a focus. When you're too relaxed, too broad of a focus. And so moderate, more of an ideal process. So let's have a look at how the stress process works. This is a model we also go through in exercise psychology, so it's a useful interactional model to help you understand. So it suggests that we progress through, and how stress affects our performance is a series of stages. And it has to do through the interpretation of whatever environmental demand is being put in our environment. So in the case of a stressor, and you might think of something like a big performance coming up, so the Big East Championship in whatever sport. And so that's the demand that is being placed on the athlete. Hey, we're going to go compete in this championship. And of course, as an athlete, there are both physical things you'd have to do there, and then psychological, being ready, being focused, goals. And so the most important stage is the perception of the demand of that competition. So ultimately, the big picture is, do I feel like I'm ready to go? Or am I not ready and therefore I'm threatened? Boy, this could be a bad situation for me. So it's the amount of threat perceived, which then affects how you will experience that stress. Will you be overly aroused? Will you have excessive anxiety? Will you have, therefore, then attentional changes in muscle tension, which will then disrupt your performance? Or will you be able to keep your arousal moderate? You manage your state anxiety. It doesn't need to go away. It just needs to be moderate. You're more relaxed, and you're more focused. Okay, so you can think of this stress response, again, on a scale of 1 to 10 as not either or, you're stressed or you're not. You're all stressed. It's just a matter of how much, and then at some point, if it's too much stress and it's on you too long, it will really disrupt your performance and not allow you to perform at the level you would like to perform at. Okay, now specifically looking at the factors that contribute to perceptions of stress, you can imagine the more important the event is, and then uncertainty due to playing conditions, who you're playing against, am I going to be ready, has my injury healed. Any of those contextual variables might enhance perceptions of stress. Whereas if you are a high trait anxious person, you have worse self-esteem, or you're concerned about how you might look out there, your social fatigue anxiety, these are all things that would increase perceptions of stress and anxiety for any particular competition or any stressful event. So always remember to factor in the person and the situation when you're trying to evaluate their behavior or a likely response to stress. A couple of the key models that I'd like to go over relate to either the relationship between anxiety or arousal and performance. One of the oldest models that's discussed in your book is called the inverted U. And I'll bet all of you fine students at West Virginia University can figure out why. Just a guess. There's just a laugher there. It's a fairly simple model, but the idea is that at low levels of physiological arousal, when you're kind of tired, you're sleepy, you're not really into it, well, you'll have a low level of performance. At moderate levels will be your best, and at high levels of arousal, you'll go back down. So it suggests that you want to keep yourself somewhere in the middle. You do want to be energized, but you do not necessarily want to be cranked up at the high point all the time, because you don't think too clearly. Your muscles get very tense when you have a high physiological arousal. You don't stick to your form. So it's a very general model that suggests that the highest levels of performance occur at moderate levels of arousal. Another model that takes this concept to a different level is by a guy named Hannon, Yuri Hannon out of Finland. Had a pleasure to meet him a couple years ago in Italy. He's a really interesting guy. And he took the inverted U idea and he suggested that individual athletes, yes, you'll have an inverted U zone, but it may be much lower for one athlete compared to other athletes, so that each athlete has their own zone where they might be too low or too high in terms of their state anxiety level. Some athletes, particularly high-level athletes who have perfected their craft, can tolerate a much higher level of state anxiety and still be in their zone. Whereas maybe newer athletes, beginners, and also perhaps those that have high trait anxiety, even if they're an elite athlete, they may prefer to be much more controlled and calm. And if they get too far out of that zone of comfort, they're not going to perform as well. So it takes the inverted U idea and then integrates it with individual factors that may influence where exactly your zone is. So that's called the IZOF hypothesis. And fairly interesting idea. One model that doesn't have a lot of great support, but it's useful to understand, is this important theoretical concept. This suggests there's a different relationship between the types of anxiety, cognitive anxiety, and then the physiological arousal. It suggests that the inverted U will be maintained for athletes that have low cognitive anxiety. They aren't really worried too much. They don't have a lot of the negative self-talk and negative attitude stuff. So it suggests that the inverted U holds in this context. But if you have an athlete that is highly worried, having a lot of negative self-talk, it suggests there's almost like a cliff that at some point it no longer becomes a curvilinear relationship. It just drops off and there's a crash and burn, a choking kind of situation. Now, I haven't seen this really play out like this in practice, and I don't know that it has great empirical support. But I can tell you that athletes with a lot of worry and a lot of negative cognitive stuff happening typically don't perform well anyway. It doesn't really matter what their level of physiological arousal is. And typically, if they're interpreting a lot of things negatively, or they have a lot of negative self-talk, their arousal is going to be high anyway. So the idea that they have any time in low arousal while they're high worried, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So this particular theory doesn't translate well for me into application, because as I mentioned, if you have a high trait anxious person that worries a lot, thinks a lot, they're over aroused already. So they don't spend a lot of time with low arousal. One theory that does have good research support is called reversal theory. This particular theory suggests that you can have all kinds of different levels of arousal and have a lot of, so your body can be cranking and feel very stressed, but depending on how you interpret those symptoms will dictate whether or not it crushes you. So this is a very useful model that suggests that a lot of athletes, they can come into a competition, they can feel the importance of it, be really pretty cranked up, and interpret that as, whoa, I'm ready to go. I'm excited. So that would be a pleasant interpretation of that event, like I'm ready. And that's ultimately, as a sports psychologist, what you want your athletes to be thinking. Very simply, like, I'm ready to go, let's get this thing going. I know what I'm supposed to be doing, let's roll. Or they can interpret those symptoms as, oh God, I'm nervous. Oh, what am I going to do? Oh, what's coach going to think if I don't get focused here? And so all of a sudden now, they're panicked, their eyes are wide, and it's certainly not being interpreted as pleasant. So arousal interpreted as unpleasant, unwarranted, uncomfortable, turns into and debilitates performance and facilitates a lot of the symptoms that we mentioned earlier. Now, a couple of things for practice here and getting into the applied, although I mentioned Chapter 12 really does a good job for that. First thing you teach athletes to do as a sports psychologist is simply to tune in to their own states. And you merge it a little bit with personality because, for example, someone that's very introverted, imagine a distance runner that's kind of introverted, keeps to themselves, is maybe a highly organized individual. They're going to prefer to be very different in their pre-race warm-up than another runner that's, really loose and free, open to new experience, totally extroverted. And so they need to kind of tune into their best performances, worst performances, and what was different maybe related to their arousal and their anxiety, so their self-talk and their feelings. And then the different strokes for different folks is totally true, because sometimes they might need to bring themselves up. They need to recognize, wow, I'm really overestimating my own ability here, or I'm underestimating an opponent. And other times I need to say, whoa, I need to calm down. I'm totally too stressed about this. And the skills that we teach athletes to control their thoughts and to breathe and control their heart rate and to control their imagery, these are the skills that help them feel more confident, because they're going to have stressful experiences. They're going to get to a big meet, a big tournament where they have never been there before, and unless they prepare and they have some skills, then the stress can overwhelm them for sure, and they're not going to be able to manage that. The last theory that links a little bit with the IZOF model, and it's a very popular one that you probably learned about in SEP 271, Sociology of Sport, is that there is a factor here in terms of your level, your skill level, on how arousal or extra stimuli in the crowd will affect performance. So if you are a new, you haven't learned a skill, or the task is fairly complex. So let's take a golf swing. It's a fairly complex motor program, and let's take a new golfer. Now, if you put 100 people out there to watch that person hit their first bag of balls, it's going to actually, their performance will get worse than if they did it by themselves. Now, for a golfer that has learned that skill, even though it's complex, many times they might have a better performance in front of a crowd, because it's forcing them to use the skills and to focus, to hone in, to have a sharper performance. So either on a well-learned skill or a simple task, having a crowd might stimulate you. Another example would be, take like a weightlifting thing, like a bench press. So alone in the gym, it's a simple task, down and up. You might be able to bench 200 pounds, and you've learned this skill, you're familiar with it. But then if you got into a competition where maybe 30 or 40 people were watching you, you might be able to get to 210, 225, something in that range. It will help you and it will facilitate. So that's the idea of social facilitation theory. Well, I hope you enjoyed some of the podcasts from this unit. I'm going to be working on getting the other podcasts up and running as we go, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the class. Cheers.